What did survival mean when freedom was denied and food had to be fought for? The food slaves stockpiled came from scarcity, crafted through strength and will. What stories still live in what they made last? Groundnut stew with foraged snails was a meal that spoke of survival, patience, and deep memory. When meat was impossible to find or too precious to use, people turned to the land itself for sustenance. Wild snails gathered after rain became the answer to hunger, their shells glistening in the damp earth. They were cleaned, boiled, and simmered slowly in a paste made from crushed groundnuts, the peanut having taken firm root in the soil and soul of the South after its long journey from West Africa. The aroma that filled the air was earthy and rich, carrying the same warmth found across generations of kitchens from Sierra Leone to South Carolina. This stew was not only food, it was endurance turned to flavor. Cooking it required time, care, and an understanding that survival meant transforming the simplest of ingredients into comfort. Those who ate it tasted both hardship and ingenuity in every bite. Ash-roasted corn cobs were the original field ration, born from necessity and fire. When cooking pots were unavailable, enslaved people wrapped whole corn cobs in layers of husk and buried them deep in hot ash until the kernels softened and browned. It was a meal that could travel, carried in cloth or pocket, eaten in silence between labor and rest. The faint char of the ash gave the corn a smoky sweetness that lingered long after the last kernel was gone. In fields where hunger pressed hard, this was survival disguised as simplicity. A meal that needed no utensil, no luxury, only heat and patience. Even after freedom came, many still roasted corn this way, a quiet inheritance of resourcefulness. What began as a means of endurance became memory, passed down through taste and the smell of burning husk. Persimmon leather was a sweetness born from scarcity, made when sugar was a dream too far from reach. Wild persimmons, soft and golden when ripe, were gathered by hand and mashed into pulp, their tartness fading into deep honeyed flavor as they dried under the southern sun. Spread thin on boards or cloth, the pulp hardened into chewy sheets that could last for months, folded and stored for the hard winter ahead. It was candy made by patience, nutrition pressed into a form that would not spoil. The process itself was quiet work, often done at the edges of daylight, each batch a small defiance against hunger. When the cold arrived and food was scarce, a strip of persimmon leather could lift spirits and soothe hunger's edge. In its sweetness lived a lesson. Survival does not always mean bitterness. Sometimes it tastes like sunlight caught in fruit. Pine bark tea was one of the oldest remedies in the arsenal of survival, brewed from the inner bark of pine trees when other nourishment was gone. The bark was stripped, boiled in water until the liquid turned deep amber, and drunk to fight scurvy, fever, or the chill of endless work. It carried a sharp, resinous flavor, bitter yet strangely comforting to those who knew it well. The tea gave strength when nothing else could, its warmth tracing a line from the forest to the heart. For those denied medicine and rest, this humble brew became both cure and comfort. It was a reminder that the earth itself could provide healing, even when people were deprived of every other resource. Pine bark tea was not just drink, it was proof that knowledge, passed from African and indigenous hands alike, could turn even bark into life. Chinquapin nut meal was a secret storehouse of strength, hidden in plain sight among the trees. The Chinquapin, a cousin of the chestnut, produced small, sweet nuts that could be gathered in the fall and ground into a fine meal. Enslaved families crushed them using stones, drying the powder in the sun to keep for months. When flour was impossible to come by, this nut meal became bread, porridge, and thickener all at once. It was light to carry but heavy with sustenance, a survival food that kept bellies full during harsh winters or long journeys. The taste was earthy, buttery, faintly sweet, a reminder that even the smallest things in nature held power. The Chinquapin tree itself became a silent ally, standing in the background of survival stories few ever told. Every handful of its meal was a small victory against hunger and hardship. Pickled watermelon rinds were the epitome of making something from nothing. a perfect reflection of the ingenuity that sustained life under impossible circumstances. The sweet pink flesh of the melon was eaten quickly, but the pale rind, normally discarded, was peeled, cut, and boiled in vinegar with cloves and sugar until translucent. Stored in jars, it became crisp, tangy, and refreshing, a treat that lasted long after harvest. It was both preservation and protest, turning scraps into sustenance. This act of saving every part of what little was available revealed a truth. Survival was not only about endurance, but about creativity. These jars lined kitchen shelves like quiet trophies, gleaming reminders that waste was a privilege few could afford. Even now, a single bite of pickled rind carries that legacy, sweet, sharp, and unbroken. Parched corn coffee was the taste of resilience in a cup. When real coffee was beyond reach, enslaved people roasted corn kernels in iron pans until they turned dark brown, then ground them into a coarse powder and steeped it in hot water. The brew was smoky, earthy, and faintly sweet, a humble echo of the luxury drink denied to them. It offered warmth in the early hours before sunrise, when labor began and the cold bit through thin clothes. Parched corn coffee was both necessity and ritual, a way to face the day with something that felt human, dignified, and shared. It was brewed from what the earth gave freely, proof that comfort could still be created from scarcity. In its bitterness was a taste of endurance, and perhaps quiet defiance too. Wild honeycomb keep was as close as survival ever came to sweetness. Finding a hive in the woods was an act of luck and courage. Collecting it required smoke, patience, and hands willing to risk pain. The honeycomb was wrapped in leaves or sealed in clay jars to preserve it for months. A single spoonful could flavor cornmeal, soothe a sore throat, or serve as a child's rare treat. Honey was a healer, a reward, a reminder that even in hardship, nature offered grace. It gleamed golden in dim light, sticky and fragrant, its taste pure as sunlight. For those who endured scarcity, it was a miracle worth protecting. A jar of wild honey was more than food. It was life itself, captured and kept safe for the days when sweetness felt far away. Roasted acorn mash was one of the earliest lessons in transformation, how something bitter could be made good. Acorns gathered from the forest floor were soaked for days to wash away their harsh tannins, then ground, roasted, and stirred into porridge or cakes. The work was slow, but the result was nourishing, dense, and filling enough to last through the hardest labor. It carried the deep, nutty scent of the woods and a flavor unlike anything from a store shelf today. Making acorn mash required patience and knowledge passed down through generations, blending African technique with native wisdom. It was survival as craft, every step deliberate, every bite earned. For those who lived on the edge of hunger, this humble meal was both shield and strength. It proved that what others overlooked could become a feast in the right hands. Cypress root brew was medicine born from necessity and wisdom. When doctors and remedies were out of reach, the roots of the cypress tree became healer and hope. Boiled into a dark, fragrant tea, it was used to ease fever, pain, and swelling, its scent filling cabins with earthy calm. The recipe came from shared knowledge, African herbal practice intertwined with indigenous tradition. It was strong, almost bitter, but it worked, and that was enough. Making it meant turning to the land, trusting it to restore what cruelty and exhaustion had taken away. Every cup was a quiet act of care in a world built on deprivation. It did not cure everything, but it reminded those who drank it that healing could still exist where freedom did not. Dried pumpkin ropes were a symbol of patience and practicality, a way to stretch one harvest into many months of meals. Strips of pumpkin flesh were cut thin with worn knives and hung near the fire to dry, curling into long ropes that hardened in the smoke and heat. These strands could be stored for months, waiting to be dropped into stews to thicken broth or soften into porridge. Pumpkin was plentiful after harvest, but fresh produce never lasted long, especially under the strain of forced labor and limited access to land. Drying it was the answer, transforming something fleeting into something enduring. The faint sweetness of rehydrated pumpkin added depth to meals made mostly from grains or roots. The ropes hung from rafters like garlands of survival, bright orange reminders that foresight and resourcefulness were as valuable as any spice. It was food that carried memory and the quiet discipline of those who refused to starve. Sun-baked clay pot beans were born from ingenuity and necessity, slow-cooked by the earth itself when firewood was scarce or forbidden. Beans were soaked overnight, sealed in clay pots with water, herbs, and bits of fat if they were lucky enough to have some. The pots were buried shallow in sun-warmed soil or left near smoldering embers to cook slowly through the day. The result was tender, smoky beans that carried the flavor of the land and the resilience of those who made them. Cooking this way saved precious wood and kept smoke from betraying their fires. It was quiet cooking, careful cooking, born from both wisdom and the need to survive unseen. When the pots were unearthed at dusk, the beans were hearty enough to feed several people, filling the belly and steadying the heart. In a world built on taking, this was a small act of keeping, of making something nourishing from the warmth of the ground itself. Sorrel leaf steep was a burst of red tang in a world that often offered little color or comfort. Made from dried hibiscus-like leaves, the steep was both drink and medicine, refreshing in heat, cleansing in illness, and joyful in spirit. It came from deep roots in West Africa, where the drink was known as bisap, and it crossed the ocean in memory long before it ever reached American soil. Boiled with ginger or orange peel when available, it turned water into something sacred, bright, and alive. For enslaved people, it was a rare taste of home, a sip that tied them to ancestors and land across the sea. It was tart, strong, and deeply red, the color of endurance itself. Even when made from wild sorrel instead of imported hibiscus, the essence remained the same, a reminder that flavor and identity could not be stripped away, only adapted. Coontie root flour was one of the rarest forms of survival food, pulled from the sandy soils of Florida's coastal woods. The Coontie, or Florida arrowroot, held starch deep within its roots, but it was also toxic until carefully processed. Enslaved people learned to grate the roots, soak them in running water for days, and dry the pulp into a fine powder. The process was laborious and delicate, but the result was precious: a clean, edible flour that could be used in bread, mush, or porridge. It was a carbohydrate reserve for when nothing else remained, sustaining life in times of famine or isolation. Each batch was a victory of knowledge over danger, of patience over hunger. The skill to prepare it safely came from generations of shared wisdom, passed quietly between hands. To turn poison into nourishment was not only survival, it was genius, born from necessity. Frog leg broth was not a delicacy then, but a resource found in the wetlands where hunger met opportunity. In low country swamps and riverbanks, frogs were plentiful and easy to catch at night with torches or bare hands. Their legs, though small, were rich in protein, and their bones gave flavor to broths thickened with roots or cornmeal. It was a meal of the marsh, humble but sustaining. Boiled with wild onions or herbs, it produced a light, savory soup that soothed empty stomachs and eased fatigue. Children were often the ones sent to catch frogs, turning play into survival work. It was food that required courage and cleverness in equal measure, proof that life could be drawn from even the smallest, quietest corners of the natural world. Frog leg broth may not have been glamorous, but it was a meal that kept people strong enough to see another day. Brine-preserved greens were an ingenious way to hold on to summer's bounty long after the fields went bare. Collards, mustard greens, and turnip tops were packed into wooden barrels filled with salt water, weighed down with stones, and sealed tight. Over weeks, the leaves softened and fermented slightly, taking on a tangy flavor that woke up the dullest winter meal. They could be rinsed and cooked with lard, onions, or whatever scraps were available. This simple method kept vitamins alive in seasons when fresh food was impossible to find. The scent that rose when the barrels were opened was sharp, earthy, and comforting, a taste of summer revived in the dead of winter. In homes that had little, these barrels represented life insurance against hunger. Preparing them required patience and precision, the kind of quiet discipline that survival demanded. The barrels lined cabin corners like silent guards against hunger, waiting patiently until their contents were needed. In every household that relied on them, brined greens became a sign of foresight and care, another way the enslaved turned hardship into nourishment, proof that even time itself could be bent toward survival when guided by wisdom and will. Sassafras bark seasoning was one of the earliest flavorings used when store-bought spices were out of reach. The roots and bark of the sassafras tree were peeled, dried, and ground into powder, its aroma rich with warmth and spice. Sprinkled over cornmeal or beans, it transformed plain food into something fragrant and satisfying. Beyond taste, sassafras carried medicinal value too. It soothed sore throats, eased stomach pains, and was believed to cleanse the blood. Its use came from a blend of African and native traditions, a shared understanding that flavor could also heal. For those whose daily meals were often bland or repetitive, this bark brought a hint of joy. Even the smallest dash felt like a luxury. When added to boiling pots, the air would fill with its woodsy scent, a moment of beauty amid scarcity. Families guarded small pouches of ground bark like treasure, passing the habit from one generation to the next. In times when dignity was stolen, seasoning food became a quiet way to reclaim it. Sassafras was more than spice. It was spirit made edible, a reminder that even the simplest flavor could speak of memory, culture, and resilience. Crushed oyster shell lime was survival ingenuity disguised as chemistry. Oysters, abundant along the southern coast, provided more than food. Their shells were burned or ground to make lime, which could be used to cure meats, preserve vegetables, or supplement diets lacking calcium. The process was slow and smoky. Shells collected, crushed, and heated until they turned white and brittle. The powder that remained was mixed into brine or rubbed onto food before storage. It could even be used to whiten walls or patch small cracks in chimneys, turning waste into utility in every sense. For those denied access to medical care or proper nutrition, this humble material offered health and preservation alike. The smell of burning shells lingered in the air, marking the intersection of hardship and invention. It was the science of necessity, born not in laboratories but in the open air by those who learned to read nature's laws through need. Even waste became resource. The oyster shell stood as a small testament to wisdom gathered from both land and sea, proof that nothing in survival was ever truly thrown away, and that even what was discarded could build the foundation of endurance. Cattail shoots were a food of hunger seasons, gathered from marshy ponds and swamps when the crops ran out. The young shoots, pale and tender near the base, could be eaten raw or boiled, tasting faintly of cucumber and corn. They grew where others saw only weeds, a secret supply of nourishment hidden in plain sight. Harvesting them meant wading into mud and cold water, cutting each stalk by hand. Cooked with salt or mixed into cornmeal cakes, they offered fiber, minerals, and hope. The cattail was generous. It provided roots for flour, leaves for weaving, and shoots for eating. Its abundance made it a silent ally to those who had little else. In the face of hunger, these swamp plants became a lifeline, a reminder that survival often grows quietly at the edge of hardship. Charred sweet cornmeal cakes were the traveler's food, built for endurance, not pleasure. The batter of ground corn, salt, and water was poured thin and cooked until crisp and dark, intentionally over-roasted to make the cakes last longer without spoiling. They were tough, smoky, and dry, but when soaked in broth or water, they softened into hearty meals again. Portable and durable, they could be wrapped in cloth and carried for days. For those who worked long hours away from fire or kitchen, these cakes were essential fuel, simple, sturdy, and reliable. The char was not a flaw but a strategy, sealing in flavor and strength. Each cake told a story of discipline, of people who could not afford to waste a grain. The smell of roasted corn was familiar and grounding, a link between past and present laborers. Each bite was proof of cleverness, born from need, a reminder that even the humblest ingredients could sustain great endurance. These cakes may not have been festive or soft, but they were food that traveled with you through struggle and survival alike, feeding body and will across endless miles of hardship. Honey locust pod syrup was one of those rare touches of sweetness that seemed like a miracle when sugar was nothing but a memory. The long brown pods of the honey locust tree were gathered carefully, cracked open, and boiled for hours in iron pots until the liquid turned dark and fragrant. Its taste was faintly like molasses, with notes of smoke and earth, thin but deeply satisfying. It took patience and firewood, two things never easy to spare, but the result brought joy to meals that might otherwise have been plain or bitter. A spoonful in corn porridge or drizzled over ash cakes could make a hard day's labor feel a little less harsh. The syrup's scent filled cabins with warmth, reminding families of better seasons. The pod itself, once discarded by others, became a small miracle of sweetness pulled straight from the land. For the enslaved, sweetness was not just flavor. It was hope, condensed into something they could hold, share, and remember. In every drop of syrup, there was a quiet act of defiance, a way to create comfort when comfort was denied, proof that ingenuity could still make life taste sweet. Jerusalem artichoke cash was a clever answer to hunger, hidden right beneath the soil. These knobby roots, also called sunchokes, grew wild and multiplied easily, making them a dependable food when nothing else survived the frost. After harvest, they were buried in cool earth or sand pits near the home, dug up one by one as winter crept in. Raw, they were crisp like water chestnuts. Boiled or roasted, they turned soft and nutty, rich with warmth. Unlike potatoes, they did not spoil quickly, and unlike corn, they required no field. They belonged to those who had the wisdom to look down, not out, to find food where others saw weeds. Families who kept Jerusalem artichokes knew security in the hardest months. Their flavor was mild, comforting, and slightly sweet, a quiet reward for foresight and care. Each tuber unearthed was a small triumph against scarcity, a quiet declaration that they would make it through another season, one root at a time, a reminder that even in cold earth, sustenance could still grow for those who knew where to look. Crab shell chowder was a meal made from what others threw away, the bones and shells left behind once the meat was gone. Along the coast, enslaved cooks learned to coax flavor from the emptiest scraps. Cracked crab shells were boiled with onions, herbs, and a bit of cornmeal or rice, creating a savory broth that smelled like the sea. Sometimes a single claw or a sliver of meat might find its way in, but most of the time, it was just shells and salt water transformed into sustenance. The broth was cloudy and briny, but it was warm and filling, enough to stretch for a family. The steam rose from the pot, rich and salty, curling into the air like a whisper of comfort. The shells gave their last bit of flavor to the pot, a final offering before being discarded again. What was once refuse became nourishment through skill and patience. It was the art of survival turned into cuisine, a testament to how deeply people could draw life from what remained after everything else had been taken. In those bowls of crab shell chowder lived resilience, proof that even emptiness could be turned into sustenance when guided by knowledge, hope, and the will to survive. Wild onion and garlic mix was both food and medicine, gathered by those who knew the land as well as any healer. In damp meadows and riverbanks, the green shoots sprouted freely, filling baskets with flavor when rations tasted dull or stale. Boiled into soups or pounded into paste, the bulbs masked bitterness and helped fight colds or fever. Their strong scent filled the air, signaling nourishment in a place where it was often scarce. The people who gathered them worked quietly at dawn, plucking the roots from the earth, grateful for the sharp fragrance that promised vitality. When boiled with beans or greens, these humble plants gave meals depth and warmth, reminding people of home, of something green and alive. Mixing wild onion and garlic with beans or greens brought a comfort that was small but deeply human. the warmth of a familiar taste. These foraged bulbs were proof that knowledge was power, and survival often depended on remembering the wisdom that nature whispered to those willing to listen. In every bowl, seasoned this way, lived both healing and defiance, the flavor of life persisting despite deprivation, a small spark of dignity and strength hidden in every spoonful. Boiled sassafras leaves, known later as filet powder, were used long before gumbo became famous. The tender green leaves were gathered fresh, dried in the shade, and pounded to a fine powder that could thicken stews and add an earthy fragrance. It turned thin broths into hearty meals and gave bland grains a taste of forest spice. This tradition, shared by native and African cooks, was a meeting of survival knowledge, a blending of worlds through food. Filet had the power to transform scraps into something comforting, its smooth texture turning necessity into delicacy. In the rhythm of cooking, the powder became a quiet bridge between cultures, its use spreading through coastal kitchens and inland cabins alike. It was not just seasoning, it was story, memory, and innovation mixed together. Long before the word Creole appeared on recipes, sassafras leaves carried the story of adaptation, of hands working together in the heat of the South. Every pinch of powder was both flavor and history, stirred quietly into the pot and passed down through generations who never forgot its worth, a shared inheritance of creativity born from constraint. Sun-cured crawfish tails were a marshland treasure, preserved through sunlight and time. Inland from the coast, those who lived near swamps trapped small crawfish in baskets or woven nets, cooking them over low flames before removing the meat. The tails were spread out on wooden boards and dried in the sun until leathery, ready to last for months. Once rehydrated, they flavored soups, rice, or cornmeal porridge with the taste of the bayou. Each batch was an act of careful labor, salting, drying, guarding from insects, and each handful stored away meant another meal secured. The air around the drying racks smelled faintly of salt and smoke, and the rhythm of turning the tails became almost ritual. This food was both preservation and preparation, a promise against hunger's return. For people who could not rely on markets or steady provisions, this practice was independence made edible. Like fish jerky, it carried both salt and strength, a trace of the water that gave it life. Every preserved crawfish tail was a memory of resourcefulness, a morsel of the marsh turned into endurance, a symbol of self-reliance drawn straight from the earth's edge. Smoked pumpkin seeds were the quiet miracle of the harvest. Nothing wasted, everything used. After pumpkins were cooked or dried, the seeds were cleaned, salted, and roasted slowly over smoldering coals. Sometimes they were left in the smokehouse overnight, gathering a deep flavor that kept pests away and preserved them for weeks. The seeds were packed in small cloth bags, tucked into pockets for long days in the fields. Rich in oil and protein, they offered strength when meals were light and days were long. The faint smokiness reminded people of autumn fires, of the scent of the earth preparing for rest. They were eaten during pauses between labor, one seed at a time, a tiny comfort against hunger. Mothers handed them to children during chores, teaching them to save what others might throw away. What began as leftovers became sustenance, a reminder that survival was not about abundance, but awareness. Every seed represented the wisdom of thrift, the art of finding nourishment in what others overlooked. In that small handful of smoke and salt was the story of endurance itself, a quiet testament to how even the smallest things could sustain the human spirit. Dried marsh millet cakes were one of the oldest improvised cereals, born from wetland grains most people ignored. Marsh millet, a wild grass with tiny seeds, grew thick in the lowlands where other crops failed. Harvesting it took time and persistence, shaking stalks into baskets until enough was gathered. The grains were pounded with stones mixed with water and pressed into small cakes that were dried in the sun. The result was chewy and nutty, filling the belly when little else could. These cakes were tough but dependable, a meal that asked for effort but gave strength in return. Eaten alone or softened in broth, They kept workers moving through endless hours of labor. Their simple flavor carried the satisfaction of something earned, not given. Stored in cloth sacks, these cakes kept for weeks and could be soaked again in broth or milk when available. They were simple, resilient, and sustaining. Food born entirely from observation and labor. In each bite was a blend of nature's generosity and human endurance, the kind of nourishment built quietly from effort rather than abundance, the taste of persistence itself. Okra and tomato stew was a garden-born staple that thrived in warm southern summers when vegetables were plentiful. Fresh okra pods, picked before they grew tough, were sliced and simmered with ripe tomatoes, onions, and bell peppers until the flavors melded into a thick, savory stew. The okra's natural thickening quality gave the dish a comforting, almost silky texture, while the tomatoes added tang and brightness. Seasoned simply with salt, pepper, and sometimes a hint of smoked meat for depth, this was a dish that could stand alone with cornbread or be served alongside fish or chicken. In African American kitchens, it was a way to make the most of backyard gardens and stretch a small amount of meat into a filling meal. It could be made entirely vegetarian or enriched with bits of bacon or ham hock, depending on what was available. The beauty of okra and tomato stew lay in its adaptability. Each household had its own variation, often influenced by what was growing just outside the kitchen door. Though it remains known in some southern homes, its presence has faded as fresh garden cooking has become less common in everyday life. Secret ingredient, but won them over with every moist bite, becoming a budget-friendly miracle in the 1970s. Pantry staples of flour, cocoa powder, and sugar were whisked with a generous spoonful of mayonnaise, whose eggs and oil gave the cake a tender crumb without extra butter. Baked in a simple rectangular pan, it emerged dark and velvety, filling the kitchen with a rich cocoa aroma. A quick frosting of powdered sugar and milk or a swirl of chocolate buttercream turned it into a dessert fit for birthdays, bake sales, or late-night treats. Families loved how the recipe saved money while delivering a texture rivaling any fancy bakery cake. Guests often guessed at the secret but rarely believed it, which made serving it even more fun. Chocolate mayonnaise cake reminded everyone that ingenuity and a bit of courage could transform an ordinary weeknight into something indulgent, proving that good taste does not need expensive ingredients when creativity leads the way. Pecan praline bars brought a taste of New Orleans. Roasted sassafras roots provided a fragrant tea with a naturally sweet, slightly spicy flavor that refreshed the spirit and offered mild stimulation. Enslaved gatherers carefully dug the young roots of the sassafras tree, washed them, and roasted them over gentle heat to draw out their aromatic oils. When steeped in hot water, the roasted roots released a deep reddish brew with notes of vanilla and citrus. This tea was enjoyed both for its taste and for traditional medicinal uses, reflecting a blend of African and indigenous knowledge about native plants. After emancipation, sassafras tea became a beloved Southern beverage, eventually serving as the base flavor for the first root beers. The practice demonstrates how a simple foraged root shaped a lasting American flavor that extends far beyond its humble beginnings. Roasted sassafras roots show how understanding the forest's offerings allowed communities to create drinks of comfort and cultural significance from ingredients freely given by the land itself. Fried green tomato. Po' boys turned unripe tomatoes into a sandwich that tasted like pure coastal sunshine wrapped in crunchy cornmeal. Thick slices of firm green tomatoes were dredged in seasoned cornmeal and fried until their edges crisped and their centers softened just enough to release a bright tang. Piled high on soft French bread with a smear of remoulade and a handful of shredded lettuce, they became a favorite along Gulf Coast streets where shrimp boats docked and music floated from open windows. Vendors often sold them at fish fries and fairs when seafood prices climbed too high, proving that a garden vegetable could carry the day as well as any oyster or crab. Families remembered the scent of hot oil and the pop of cornmeal batter while waiting in line for a sandwich that blended thrift and celebration. Today, fast food counters try to imitate the flavor, but they cannot capture the quiet magic of fresh garden tomatoes picked before ripening, fried in backyard kitchens, and shared among neighbors who knew the value of every bite. Stewed okra with cornmeal dumplings was a dish that blended frugality with comfort in a way that stuck with families for decades. Okra, often grown in backyard gardens, went into a simmering pot with onions, tomatoes, and broth until it softened into a thick stew. My grandmother would mix simple cornmeal batter, drop spoonfuls into the bubbling pot, and let the dumplings cook until they puffed into tender bites. The texture of the okra thickened the stew naturally, giving it body without needing flour or cream. Each bowl carried the flavor of the garden, earthy and sustaining, with dumplings that filled the stomachs of tired workers. It was food that came straight from the soil and stretched further than its ingredients suggested. Children grew up eating this dish as a matter of routine, yet it became part of the rhythm of survival. In the 1960s, stewed okra with cornmeal dumplings was a staple that represented both thrift and ingenuity, turning humble vegetables and flour into something worthy of pride at the dinner table. Baked raccoon with sweet potatoes was a hearty, deeply flavorful dish that reflected the ingenuity of rural African-American hunting communities. When store-bought meat was scarce or too costly, raccoon provided a source of fresh protein for those who knew how to prepare it properly. The raccoon meat was carefully cleaned, soaked to remove any strong flavors, and then seasoned with herbs, onions, and spices before being baked low and slow. Sweet potatoes, sliced thick and arranged around the meat, soaked up the savory juices as they roasted, creating a sweet and salty pairing that filled the house with an irresistible aroma. This dish was not only about nourishment, it was about community and the skill of turning what the land provided into a meal worth gathering for. Often prepared during the cooler months after a successful hunt, it brought people together around the table to share stories and warmth. While today most people have never tasted raccoon, those who grew up with it remember its richness, the tender texture, and the way the sweet potatoes balanced its earthiness. It was more than just dinner. It was a reminder of self-sufficiency and resourceful cooking passed down through generations. Chilled showstopper of warm weather socials, a snowy white vision that cooled the hottest summer evenings. A light sponge cake baked in a large rectangular pan provided the base, while a creamy coconut frosting made with evaporated milk and sweetened shredded coconut blanketed the top like fresh snow. After chilling, the cake absorbed the frosting's rich flavor, turning each bite into a tender tropical treat. Served in generous squares at backyard picnics or family reunions, it delivered sweetness without heaviness, perfect after barbecue or spicy foods. Guests admired the way the coconut caught the light, sparkling like tiny crystals as the cake was sliced. In African-American households of the 1970s, coconut sheet cake became a seasonal favorite that signaled celebration and hospitality. Its simplicity and ability to feed a crowd made it a practical choice, while its striking appearance ensured it was remembered long after the last square disappeared from the platter. Lemon chess pie shone with bright flavor. Wild grape must connected plantation kitchens to the native abundance of the American South. Muscadine and scuppernong grapes grew untended along fences and forest edges, providing a dependable late summer harvest. Enslaved workers gathered the clusters and crushed them by hand to create a tangy juice that could be fermented slightly for a refreshing drink or boiled into a syrupy must used to season grains and greens. This technique echoed West African traditions of using fruit reductions to brighten savory dishes. After emancipation, muscadine wine and homemade grape jellies became hallmarks of Southern foodways, and small farms still produce them today. The careful gathering and slow simmering required patience and skill, qualities that defined the cooking of those who made the most of every wild resource. Wild grape must stand as both a practical recipe and a testament to how African-American cooks merged Old World techniques with New World ingredients, leaving a flavor that continues to shape regional preserves and beverages across the Carolinas and Georgia. Hoghead cheese was a triumph of resourcefulness, transforming every part of the animal into a dish of surprising elegance. After a hog was butchered, the head was simmered slowly with onions, herbs, and spices until the meat fell from the bone. The rich broth was strained and cooled, setting into a savory jelly that held tender shreds of meat and subtle seasoning. Sliced and served cold with crackers or bread, it became a delicacy at gatherings where nothing was wasted and flavor was celebrated. Making it required patience and skill, with families sharing techniques that varied from one household to the next. Children watched the slow process with a mix of curiosity and awe, learning that thrift could create unexpected pleasures. Today, few people undertake the labor of hog-head cheese, and store-bought versions lack the character of the homemade original, but its history endures as a testament to resilience and the deep respect African-American cooks held for every gift the animal provided. Boiled turnips with cornbread crumbs was another way families stretched cheap vegetables into full meals. Turnips were easy to grow and often given away, their strong flavor softened by boiling them until tender. My grandmother ladled the hot turnips into bowls and topped them with crumbled cornbread, the bread soaking up the broth until it became hearty enough for supper. It was plain food, yes, but it kept stomachs full on nights when meat was scarce. The bitterness of the turnips mellowed with time and seasoning, and the cornbread gave every bite body and comfort. Children might have grumbled, but they ate their fill because there was no room for waste. In the 1960s, this dish was common across kitchens that relied on ingenuity to make ends meet. It was a simple combination, yet it carried dignity because it represented survival. Boiled turnips with cornbread crumbs may not have been fancy, but it held families together through lean times. Ash-cooked sweet potatoes were a simple yet unforgettable treat. Whole sweet potatoes were nestled directly into the hot ashes of a wood-burning fireplace or outdoor fire pit, slowly roasting until their skins blackened and their insides caramelized. The result was a soft, smoky sweetness that needed no sugar or butter to shine. In African-American households, especially in rural areas without modern ovens, this method was both practical and flavorful. The smell of roasting sweet potatoes would fill the air, drawing children and adults alike to the hearth. Once cooked, they could be split open and eaten right from the skin, often as a snack on cold evenings. This was food tied to patience and tradition, a reminder that sometimes the simplest preparations yield the richest flavors. Today, with most cooking moved indoors and convenience foods replacing old methods, ash-cooked sweet potatoes are rarely made, but for those who tasted them, they remain unmatched. Molasses spice cookies carried the deep flavors of Gullah and Low-Country tradition into modern kitchens, each chewy bite echoing centuries of coastal heritage. Dark molasses blended with brown sugar to create a dough rich with warmth, while cinnamon, ginger, and cloves filled the air as the cookies baked. Rolled in coarse sugar before hitting the oven, they emerged crackled and fragrant, their centers soft and slightly sticky. The taste balanced sweet and spicy with a lingering note of caramel that made them irresistible alongside a glass of cold milk or a cup of tea. In the 1970s, these cookies connected generations, offering a tangible link to the flavors of ancestors who baked with what the land and sea provided. Families shared them during holiday gatherings or quiet evenings alike, savoring the way tradition lived on in every spice-filled bite. Molasses spice cookies proved that a simple treat can carry profound meaning, turning an ordinary snack into a celebration of history, memory, and enduring sweetness. Sheep sorrel soup brought a welcome spark of bright flavor after months of heavy grains and salted meat scraps. This common wild plant, with its arrow-shaped leaves and natural lemony tang, grew freely in meadows and along woodland edges. Enslaved gatherers picked the young leaves early in spring, rinsed them well, and simmered them with water and a handful of onions or garlic if available. The result was a light, refreshing broth rich in vitamin C and a gentle tartness that awakened tired palates. African culinary traditions often prized sour greens, and this soup reflected that taste while also serving an important nutritional role in preventing scurvy. After emancipation, sheep sorrel remained a favorite wild green in many rural communities, used in teas and simple soups that celebrated the arrival of warmer weather. Today, foragers still seek it for its tangy bite and health benefits. Sheep sorrel soup stands as a quiet example of how careful observation of the land turned common weeds into an enduring part of Southern culinary heritage. Sweet potato pie with brown sugar meringue crowned holiday tables with a beauty that matched its flavor. Smooth, mashed sweet potatoes blended with warm spices created a filling as rich as any custard, poured into a flaky handmade crust. The crowning touch was a cloud of meringue whipped with brown sugar until caramel-scented peaks formed and browned lightly in the oven. Families saved the first slice for honored guests or elders, a sign of respect and affection. The pie carried the sweetness of the southern soil and the skill of generations who knew how to stretch simple ingredients into celebration. Children licked the mixing bowls clean while parents watched the meringue rise, a shared moment of anticipation before the feast. Over time, commercial pies and instant mixes dulled the tradition, but those who remember the warm aroma of brown sugar meringue know that this dessert is more than food. It is a memory of family love, patient hands, and the quiet pride of homemade beauty. If these stories of survival foods taught you something new, share your thoughts in the comments, pass this history forward with a like, and subscribe so the past never goes hungry again.